Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, everyone.
Evening, doctor.
How are you all? How are you all today, this evening?
Good, Alhamdulillah.
Semua sihat, okay?
Sehat, Doctor.
Yeah, okay, good. All right, so we'll just take a minute and let everybody get online here, yeah? Okay, let's get started. So welcome to week 3. I hope everyone's okay. We've still got a few people trickling in. I got a couple more messages this week about people just joining the class. So I think it's going to be one of those semesters where everything is still kind of chaotic. So if there's any new students joining us tonight, welcome to the class. So this is our normal meeting time. And so tonight we have our, of course, our weekly presentation, reading presentation. And let me just switch screens here and move over to Pucha Blast. We can just look at tonight's agenda. So we are into week 3 already. Okay. And so our class tonight, please, just to remind everyone, make sure you check your attendance, yeah? Click on the attendance and join. Make sure you get counted for the attendance tonight. So just to start with some housekeeping issues, we last week I promised I would start uploading the slides, the student slides. Okay, so last week we had our first presentation, which was very nicely done, and I have uploaded those slides into a new folder. So you can see in Pucha Blast at the end here we have our recorded classes. So the videos are all there of the classes, and then we have our weekly presentations, weekly reading presentations here. These are also going to be uploaded as well. So last week, Amira and Mutiara's slides are here. And then for those of you that present each week, you can upload your slides directly here into Pucha Blast. And then I will post them. After that, I will post them here in the same folder. Okay? So you can, of course, you can use those later for when you do your assignment 2, your project, as well as for when you do your study for your final exam. Those will be available to you. Okay, so that's taken care of. And what else did I want to share? So today we're gonna focus on the reading presentation. We have a very interesting article. At least I think it's interesting about a little bit of the historical context of youth. Where the whole idea and notion of youth sort of originates from, and how that led to where we are today in terms of our understanding, our definition, and how we work with young people. All right, it's a very, very important article because history is something that people tend to either love history or hate history. Um, I love history. I know people, my wife, she has really very little interest in history. I don't know, maybe many of you do as well. I think a lot of it has to do with how you're oriented to history and how you were taught history, especially when you were in school. History is the kind of subject that can be taught very well. It can be really interesting, or it can be incredibly boring. Okay, that tends to be the dichotomy with history education. So depending on how you were really taught history, I think it has a lot to do with your appreciation of it. I had some very good history teachers, and I think it really rubbed off on me, and I really have a strong appreciation for history. But I think also just understanding where you come from and where these ideas come from is very important, especially to understand why we are the way we are today. So as graduate students, okay, and I'm gonna, throughout the semester, I'm gonna lay that on you quite a bit. I'm gonna lay that burden of being a graduate student on you often, because to be a graduate student is not something that you should take lightly. Graduate education is really an intellectual journey, and I think you need to make investments in the intellectual side of your graduate education, meaning that um, you have to sort of work through it. You have to read a lot, and you have to really strive to understand your topic area that you're studying. Okay, so it's a really important article anyway. Tonight's article, and the writer Howard Sercombe is a really he's a very good scholar in the field of youth work, and I think his writing is really good as well. So I look forward. I really look forward to the presentation tonight. Maybe I'm the only one that's excited, but I hope you will also be excited. And then after that, I know there was a suggestion last week that I go over the assignment 2 in a bit more detail, and I will, inshallah, I am ready to do that tonight. Okay, so I have uploaded, as you can see here, I've uploaded more details about the assignment. Okay, so this file here gives a more detailed overview of the assignment and what you're expected to do. And then I've actually even uploaded, hey, why is there only one file here? There should be 3 files. I've uploaded 3 example program organization critiques from previous semesters, okay? So those are just to give you an idea of the expectation for what you are supposed to do, okay? So between the assignment details, the file here about the details, as well as the examples, you should have a very good idea of what you're expected to do. Okay, I'm not sure why there's only 1 file here. I uploaded 3. Let me just see what happens. Oh, it's just uploading 1 of them. I don't know why that is. All right, I'll have to go back and check that. And anyway, these 3 examples are very good examples. They were 3 of the top assignments from last semester. Okay, so if you want to get a really good score on that assignment, if you want to do really well, you know, you can use those as a guide. Okay, and again, I'm not sure why there's only 1 here. Anyway, I will go back and correct that, inshallah, later. Okay, so are there any yeah, and that's gonna be pretty much it for tonight. One thing about time and class time, I'm not a huge believer in the idea that you have to take up all 3 hours of the class just because the class is scheduled from 6 to 9. We have to go all the way to 9 o'clock every night. Some weeks we will, like last week we went to 9 o'clock. This week, I don't know, maybe we will, maybe we won't. Okay, some nights we may end a little bit early. It depends. I'm not really the kind that gets handcuffed by the clock, so to speak. Okay, so once I feel that we've covered the material for the week, we can end class. So we play it by ear, really, is what I'm trying to say. All right. And so once we've done the presentation and I've gone through the assignment, we'll call it a night for today. Okay. So that's what we have planned today. And are our presenters all ready? Ready to go? We'll just get
That's
started in a minute. You
yeah,
ready to go?
we are ready. Yeah, we are ready to go.
Fatin looks very excited, so that's good to see.
But inside, I'm nervous.
Yeah, that's normal. So does anybody have anything they want to share or ask before we start? Any questions, any comments? Anyone would like to? Any reports? Do you guys know what today is in the US, by the way? It's a very big day in the United States. No, it's
Yeah,
election
President
day.
Day, right?
Pilihan Raya, election day in the US. So we will know tomorrow whether we have 4 more years of Trump or if we have a new president. So, and
What is
actually,
your
So what do you think?
yeah?
I knew you were going to ask that.
Who will be the president?
Well, it's of course, they have in the US, they have all these polls, they take these polls, like surveys of the people before the election. They try to figure out who's going to win. And what happened in 2016 was all the polls said that Hillary Clinton was going to win. So everyone was very confident that she was going to win. And then, of course, what happened was she lost. So this time, everyone is kind of like, no one really trusts what the polls say, because even though the polls say that Trump's going to lose, he might still win again. So, yeah, I don't know. The U.S. is in a difficult state right now. It's being ravaged. It's being totally ravaged by COVID-19. The economy is really bad. Like a lot of countries, but the U.S. is extremely bad. COVID-19. The other day, the U.S. had 90,000 cases in one day.
Yeah, I heard that.
2,000 deaths in one day from COVID-19 and 90,000 cases in one day. Malaysia's only had 30,000 over 8 months. So Malaysia's doing pretty good compared to the US. Malaysia's doing very well. So yeah, so there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot at stake. Elections, the president actually doesn't have as much power as people think. In fact, the US president has a lot less power than the Malaysian prime minister does. Malaysian prime minister has a lot more power. And the reason is that in the American system of government, there are a lot of checks and balances against the power of the president. So actually, whoever wins the presidency, it's not that important. It's not as important as who controls the Congress. That's the more important one, because Congress is the one that really passes laws. So in the American system, it's also important to see who controls the Congress in addition to the presidency. So we shall see tomorrow. Inshallah, we'll see. But
Yeah.
yeah. So anybody a big Trump fan out there? Any Trump fans?
Not me.
He's really crazy. Oh, Bella, you like Trump?
No, not me, I said.
I didn't think. Yeah, I'm sure he's not very popular in China.
Yeah, Trump is very popular, but I
He's
think
very popular.
I prefer Obama
Oh,
than
you like?
Trump.
Oh, you like Obama?
Yeah.
A lot of Asian people liked Obama.
Yeah.
I noticed that. Yeah. Obama was very, I mean, one thing about Obama is, I mean, I don't think he was actually a great president personally, but what he was he was a very ethical president. In 8 years, he did not have a single major ethical scandal or whatever. He had a very clean administration. And that's one of the things that people tend to overlook about him and his administration. They talk about certain maybe policy failures he had, or he wasn't good at this, or he did this okay, but they neglect the fact that he didn't have a single scandal in his whole 8 years as president, ethically speaking, which is pretty amazing, especially nowadays. So he was a pretty ethical president. So we'll see what the future holds, but I have to make lots of dua. So okay, so anyway, let's get started with our presentation, because I just can't wait to get to this article. And I think this article is very eye-opening once you read it and you see a little bit, you understand a little bit more about how the whole notion of youth and teenager and adolescence came into being. Okay, it is a modern invention, as we will see in a minute, and it's had tremendous impacts on society and on the way that we think about young people and how we treat young people. Okay, so let's hand it over to our presenters. Let me make sure you guys can share the screen here. Hold on. Okay, so you should be able to share. Okay, so who'd like to start? Fatin, are you just going to start?
Okay, yeah, yes, Prof. Thank you very much for inviting us. Are we really going to start now? Can we start now, Prof?
Sure.
Okay.
I think I've given enough of an introduction. So yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, all right. Let me.
So just to remind you, Fatin, so after each slide that you present, just pause a bit so that I can give some, I can comment and we can have questions as well. Okay.
All right, sure.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wait, let me check with my group members. Are you guys ready? Okay, all right. So far, so good.
They're
All
ready to go.
right,
Okay, good.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good evening to our respectable lecturer, Prof. Latif, and my fellow friends. We are from Group 2, and today we are going to present on the Week 3 topic entitled Youth in a Global or Historical Context. So before we begin our presentation, I would just like to take a minute to just introduce the group members. Okay, in the group members, it is consists of me, myself, Fatin Amira binti Abdul Aziz, and then we have Nabila binti Cik Din. Maybe Nabila, you can wave to the screen. Say hi to everybody.
Hi.
Okay, that's Nabila. And then another charming lady in our group is Roshakina binti Makzuki. Kak Kina, say hi please.
Hi.
Okay,
Hi.
that is Roshakina. All right, so there are three of us trying to summarize the article for today, and we hope that our presentation will help you all to further understand about what the title is all about. But being there any misunderstanding or misconcept on the topic, we do hope that Prof will assist and guide us all.
Inshallah.
Okay, Prof.
Inshallah.
Okay. All right, so let's move on to the content of our presentation today. We divided the main contents into five subtopics. This is accordance to the article itself. Okay, the first part is the overview to explain what is youth. And then the second part is the creation of a youth category, that is the invention and emergence of schools. The third segment is the creation of youth work practice. This is in response to the youth social problem. The fourth part is the youth as a scientific object and the emergence of the discourse of adolescence. And finally, the globalization, which discuss the modern concepts of youth.
Wow,
Right,
your slides are so nice.
Oh, all right. Thank you,
Beautiful
Prof. We
slides.
try to make it as young people as possible.
Yeah, I'm gonna
That's why I'm
send mine to
wearing
you guys to
yellow too.
consult.
Okay. All right, so let's get into the overview first. Okay, what is youth after all? So according to Hacking, he stated that human identities are not natural, but it developed from time to time influenced by social processes, such as political or administrative. Those factors then turn a person into being a new kind of person. Okay, so it seems like Hacking's connotation is rather similar to what Amira and Muchara had presented last week, where the identity of youth are influenced by various environmental contexts, such as families, peer relationships, and political surroundings. And then Rabino also claimed that human beings live through a sense of self and subjectivity, which shapes their lives, responses, and relationships. These selfhoods or subjectivities emerge with particular historical and political locations, which then facilitate and demand certain things, certain ways of being. So based on these two connotations and remarks, youth falls under the same category, which it is not a natural category. It cannot be distinguished solidly like we specify childhood and adulthood. So even in some societies, it appears that they have not felt the need to have youth category. Okay, so next. So then how youth is different. For societies that acknowledge youth, youth has different meanings. The first difference is that there is a point of entry and exit entry, which refer to the age or symbolic indicators. And also the roles and duties of youth are also different. And then the third difference is the deemed attributes and capacities. And finally, the connection of youth with others called social roles and institutions are also different. So all these things are subject to change over time. Even if there is anything biological about youth, it is not the biology that determines what it means to live as a young person, but rather the social and historical context that is counted.
Okay.
Okay, is there anything you want to add in, Prof?
No, so far so good.
All right, so I shall proceed with the fourth
Sure.
slide. All right, so to understand about youth definition, we need to look back into the history and revolution of youth. This is like what Prof mentioned just now, because the processes that has occurred in the 19th and 20th century might be reproduced again in the modernization times. For the matter of fact, let us look at how Foucault made the analogical of youth constitution. Okay, the first part is that the population in questions needs to be separated. In this example, Foucault's example, in the medieval period, the madness group of people was understood either as demonic possession or through the identity of the fool or the village idiots.
Yeah.
And generally, they are tolerated as sometimes amusing and sometimes annoying in the community. And then in the 17th century, during the Great Confinement, the mad people are grouped with other populations like street prostitutes, orphans, people with disabilities, alcoholics, and unemployed. So they were all cleared off the streets and put into a workhouse or asylums. And this way of separating them is separating them with the general population, make them easy and available to be inquired or enable development of knowledge about them. So basically, the subject population becomes the respondents of the particular study. So next, driven by the Royal Societies and new culture of scientific studies, the gentlemen scholars built reputations and wrote books on the scientific nature of a range of human conditions. Therefore, the madness group of people are gradually reconfigured as mental illness. From madness, they are called to be having mental illness. Then the study developed then so that they can be treatable by a specialism of medicine that is called psychiatry. So from there, the emergence of psychiatry field occur. After that, the subject identity is adopted by the subject population, whereby the subject population, that is the madness group of people just now, collaborate in their subjection, constitution, and adoption of the subject identity. A mad person learns how to be a mental patient and what is required of them in that role. With that history of process, psychiatry emerged as an official discourse or field. However, other discourses still survive or coexist, like the demonic possession discourse.
Okay, so this is a really important slide and part of the whole argument that he makes here. So he gives us as Fatin described, he gives us an analogy. How did we end up with this category of youth that is actually separate from the general population? And of course, in a Western context, usually when they say youth, they're really referring to adolescents, teenagers, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because actually the word youth has a different connotation than teenagers or adolescents. So it's really the creation of the adolescent, all right? And we, in sort of informal parlance, we call it teenagers, but scientifically it's called adolescence, and that's typically the teenage years. But what he's saying is that prior to the 1800s, really, there was no such thing as adolescence. It was invented essentially. It was invented as a separate group from the rest of the population, as Fatin said, a subject population. In other words, they came up with a separate identity for this particular group. And so he's giving the analogy of the mentally ill individual. They used to call them mad people, meaning they were just sort of the village idiot, sort of people that were just a little bit bonkers, they were a little bit different than everybody else, They were just part of regular society until one day scientists began to realize that they were actually suffering from these things called mental illnesses. And from there, the whole field of mental illness and psychiatry came out of that. So what allowed that to happen was they identified this group as being having their own identity, these mentally ill individuals. And then they, by doing that, by separating them as a separate group, they could then be studied scientifically. Okay. And so he's using that to show the same how the same thing happened eventually with youth or with adolescents. All right. Prior to that, there was no such thing as adolescence. You were a child, and then you were an adult. And even the line between childhood and adulthood in those days was even quite blurred, because at a very young age, children were doing very adult things like working, like taking on adult roles and all, and that sort of thing. So he's giving us the analogy of how this whole subject population idea of youth came into being, and he's using these sort of mad people, or the idea of the mentally ill individual as the example. Okay, so it's an interesting evolution of how that happened. Okay, so please continue. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Prof.
Okay.
So, so how does the analogical of youth constitution relate to the topic, to the youth development of today? I think Prof basically has done the explanation just now. Okay, so according to SECOM, the writer itself, the constitution of youth as a subject follows the same kind of the process. So with what happened to the emergence of psychiatry, so the same thing happened to youth. Okay, so throughout our presentation of today, we will further explain how cultural and historical diversity influenced development of youth from the 19th and 20th centuries through the Industrial Revolution, and then through the massive political, scientific, and cultural changes that came with capitalism. However, all these discussions are made within the context of Western context.
Yes,
right?
and that's important. That is very important to mention, because when the time period they're talking about, the 1700s and so forth, the West was beginning to it was coming out of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and so forth. But there had been, prior to that, of course, the Islamic civilization was really the main global civilization, the main global superpower at the time. And of course, many of these articles, they don't talk about pre-Renaissance or pre-Enlightenment periods. So the West, in many ways, was way, way behind what was already going on in other parts of the world. Like, for example, we know, and the sad thing is that there's just not a lot of literature about this from sort of the pre-Renaissance period. So we don't really know, for example, how youth were in the Islamic civilization, or even going back further, the Chinese civilization, and these other great global civilizations. We don't really know much about it, but we do know certain things, like, for example, the Islamic civilization was the first civilization to consider 15 as an age where a child can become a soldier in war. There was an actual age that Islam laid down. Prior to that, children fought in wars all the time, and even in the West, up until 1600s, 1700s, they were as well. So there's a lot of things we don't really know in terms of what was going on in other parts of the world and that sort of European that pre-European period. Okay, so again, this is taken from a European perspective, so we have to be mindful of that. Okay, and I've looked for other sources from other, especially from the Islamic perspective, other sources, and there's just not a lot that I've come across, at least yet. Maybe there are. Okay, sorry, Fatin.
Okay,
I'm
all
gonna
right.
keep interrupting you, so sorry. I'll say sorry
No
now.
problem, sir. It's okay. It's okay, sir. All right. So to further continue with our presentation, next I would like to invite the next presenter, Miss Roshakina. Hand over to you, Kak Kina.
Okay. Thank you very much, Fatin. Hello and Assalamualaikum to our lecturer and to all my fellow friends. Okay, now I will continue about the creation of a youth category. Okay, as you know, the historical development of the adolescent actually was invented at the same time as steam engine. So do you imagine the development of the adolescent has been invented a long time ago. It is referring to the Frank Mangrove 1984 in the page 33. And for the colleague, you can refer about my presentation on the article on page 21. Okay, next.
Sorry, can I stop you there, Roshakina?
Okay.
Before you show your next slide, I want to ask the class, what do you think that means, the invention of adolescence? How do you invent adolescence?
No.
Okay, but tonight's speakers, you cannot answer the question because you've already done the reading. So I'm just wondering if anybody else in the class can answer that question. What does it mean to invent adolescence? Like, how do you invent? I mean, because that quote is very interesting. The adolescent was invented at the same time as the steam engine. I mean, you can understand how you invent a steam engine, right? You create this train or whatever. But how do you invent an adolescent? What does that mean? Anyone want to guess?
Prof, when they go to secondary school?
Okay. So that's when they were invented?
Ah, yes.
So before
I guess.
secondary school, there was no such thing as an adolescent. That's what you're saying?
Yes, they are still children.
Okay. They're children. Okay. So only with the advent of secondary school, then they became something called adolescents. Okay. All right. Thank you. Zilawati, thank you. Anyone else? Of course, I can see you've read the article, so that's definitely part of how the category came into being, yes. And we're about to learn more about that. Anyone else want to take a crack at it? Does that mean that young people weren't around at that time? They suddenly came into being? What does it mean to invent adolescence? No one. I know Mutiara is not here tonight because she would probably have given me an answer. Anyone else?
Doctor, it seems like the terms is have to be clear. It's like that.
Okay, why? The term has to be created. Why?
Maybe because of the problem that they face at that time. Therefore, they have to specific a certain group of people to make sure they can solve the problem for that group of people. That's my opinion.
Yeah, okay, all right. So because they were presenting a specific problem in society decided to sort of give them this label so that society could deal with them as a unique category. Is that what you're saying? Did I capture what you're trying to say?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, all right. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think you're both right. Both answers are definitely on the right track. And let's let the presenters present first, and they'll answer it, and then we will continue discussing.
Okay, Thank you, Doctor.
Okay.
Okay, actually invented, I can explain further
Okay.
for our next slide. Okay, actually, according to the ARIS 1962, page 29, people have no idea of what called adolescent, like Doctor mentioned before. And the idea was a long time taking shape. And from the pre-industrial family phase, by age 14, majority will be living in a state or semi-dependent, will move to become a servant in other household and become apprentice living in their master home, or they become a student boarding away from their family. And then young people will live with in other household of their employee until they could establish an independent household by marriage or inheritance. This is based on the, according to the Gillies, and describe a stage of use in the pre-industrial period significantly different from modern conception. And then beginning to be a very young age, children begin to separate from their family and their life in other household, which means in this era, once they become the adolescent, they will separate and live in other household, not stay together with their family. So they will call adolescent. Okay, next.
So that's really interesting if we think about that. That means that most young people, by the age of 14, of course, there was no secondary school, there was no high school, right? They were living in either as servants in households, if that's, and that's more or less the lower and working class individuals, or families, sorry, or they were apprentices living in their master's homes or students in boarding school away from the family. Now, boarding schools, of course, were not like today's boarding schools. They're very different, of course. But think about that. A young person living in the home of their apprentice. Now, what's really interesting, one of the things that is being proposed to address youth unemployment during COVID-19 is to go back to the apprentice system, where we actually place young people in organizations to sort of learn in one-on-one formats or in very small on-the-job sort of training situations where young people can directly learn skills and they can develop those skills and then transition into jobs and so forth. So there's this talk about going back to an apprenticeship model. And if you think about what it means to be an apprentice, you know, schools, if you think about school, school is one student, or sorry, one teacher to how many students? Sometimes 40, 50 students in a class, right? Even in university, look at our universities now, even to this class, we have 25, 30 students. The apprenticeship system is a one-on-one educational organization. The apprentice is learning directly from the master in a one-on-one situation. And if you look at it from an HRD perspective and a training perspective, it is the ideal type of learning arrangement, because the best, according to research, the most effective form of training is on-the-job, one-on-one training. So think about it. They were in that time, many of them who were learning as apprentices were getting this incredible education, actually. Of course, the education they're getting was for trade, you know, to become an ironsmith or to become a woodworker, or, you know, it's more of a trade, like a what we would call a TVET education today. Okay, but this is what, before there was a system of schooling, you know, of organized compulsory schooling at the secondary level. They had this. So it's very interesting. Young people were doing much more adult things at much younger ages in the pre-modern, pre-industrial revolution period. Okay, and that's what he's trying to show here. It was a very different world for young people at that time. All right, I think that's very interesting. Okay, any questions or comments about that? There's several points in this article where what he talks about is very relevant to what's going on today with COVID-19, with young people, the kind of discussion that's being, you know, how do we deal with all these young people being unemployed and losing jobs, and how do we create job opportunities for them? There's a lot of overlap with what happened during the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and we're gonna see a lot of those parallels. It's very interesting. Okay, please proceed. Unless there's any questions.
Okay, next. Okay, next topic is about the emergence of school and the erosion of intergenerationality. Very difficult to pronounce. And then the author of this article have divided the category of the adolescent into a few class family. The first one is used in middle class family. Okay, middle class family is first abandon the practice of sending out their children to work with other household due to increasingly social mobile and therefore status conscious. Middle classes fear in the association of their offspring with servant. They are not mess around with the servant. And then in the early of 19th century, children were kept at home for girls until they get married, and for boys until they went to the university or some professional apprenticeship program.
Homeschooling.
And during, pardon?
Sorry, that's today's homeschooling, basically, what we call homeschooling. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right. So in the 1930s and in 1830s and 1840s, crisis unemployment among the educated young attended more panic among bohemianism and political rebellion. The middle classes began to control over their young, and the major institution for achieving this was the school. And according to Die House 1981, local private school does exist for girls, but girls are still controlled within patriarchal home, which is our prof just mentioned just now about the homeschooling, whereby they have a private tutors. And towards the end of the 19th century, boarding school become popular for the daughters. And according to CAT 1977, CAT actually focused on in the American, and in America records that equal numbers of girls and boys in the lower grade of early 19th century in elementary school, but the figure dropped once girls entered their teens, but they didn't. But the CAT didn't mention the age, the teen age.
Okay, so now, again, parallels with today. So in the 1830s and 40s, crisis of unemployment among the educated youth, okay? In other words, not enough jobs, oversupply of youth, undersupply of job opportunities. The solution was, did you guys all catch that? What was the solution at that time? It's right there in the slides. What was the solution?
Children were kept at home.
Right, but then there was this, if you look at the middle,
program.
the middle bullet there, okay? During 1830s and 40s, crisis of unemployment, okay? The middle class began to control over the young, and the major institution for achieving this was the school. So schooling became more widespread to address the issue of unemployment and to stop what was called the moral panic of the time. In other words, there were too many young people that were idle. They weren't working. They weren't doing anything. They're just getting into trouble, right? Because there was this unemployment. So they created more schools. Okay, they created more schools. They created schools in general. Okay, at that time there was no, like it said, there was most children were schooled at home. Okay, only the elites would have these boarding schools and so forth. But this is the majority of the youth they're talking about here. Okay, so they created this industry of education called schools. So if we think about today and the crisis we're having now, oversupply of youth, undersupply of job opportunities, maybe the solution is to create more universities. Maybe the solution is to create more schools or more educational opportunities for young people. That's what was done back then. Okay, so we can see some parallels. It's very interesting. And the responses that those at that time, that policymakers, how they dealt with it was really the creation of the school as an industry. All right, so let's read more about that. Go ahead.
Okay. Next. Next. Fatin. Fatin, next.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry. There's a. I didn't open my chat box here. Okay. Oh, so there's a question here. So when adolescent become a term or single subject? Okay. So when did it become a term? Well, we haven't gotten there yet, Kong. So just hold on a second. Okay. Just hang on. We're gonna get there. Okay. It's coming. Thank you for the question. Okay. Sorry.
Shall I continue?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. I'm sorry, because this word is redundant. Okay. And then next is, so to answer to your question just now, in the 19th century, reform boarding school became the model of establishment school, was a total institution, guaranteeing discipline is dividing practice for young men to control and training, and was essential component of the constitution of youth. Okay, you want to add on anything, sir?
So they used, since there were some boarding schools out there for elite families and elite youth, they used that as the sort of model for creating this institution of school, right? And this idea that we could occupy the youth by keeping them in school longer, right? Because as the Industrial Revolution hit, of course, they started to have things like big factories, and so there were a lot of job losses because a lot of those jobs were taken by adults. Okay, so they created the school, and it was modeled after the boarding school as a total institution, right, including discipline, right, as well as learning and education and so forth. So it was also seen as a way of molding youth behavior, okay, controlling youth, etc. All right. So it was, as he says in the article, it says, as the role of the school in controlling a now extended period of dependence, okay, became critical, schooling itself became standardized and subject to official control. All right. So it became an institution of control, really. All right. An institution that was dedicated to the control and training of young men, especially young men. And this was an essential component of the Constitution of Youth. So this is where the whole idea and the notion of youth began to take shape, right? So now we're going to keep young people in this institution called school for longer periods of time. Okay, so we're going to sort of extend their childhood because they're not really entering the workforce or anything. So we're going to sort of extend their childhood by keeping them in these institutions called schools. All right, and so this gradually began to happen in the 1800s. Okay, any questions about that? Comments?
Prof.
Yeah.
In the second paragraph, it states that in the end of 19th century, girls outnumber boys in secondary school. Actually, why it happened?
Okay, which paragraph? Sorry, on page.
The second paragraph. This slide, but the second paragraph.
Oh, sorry, I'm looking.
The girls outnumber boys.
Yeah, because okay, so he talks about that. Girls began to enter school in high numbers because of the increasing need for teachers, actually. So, and for whatever reason, he doesn't really say, but for whatever reason, teaching, especially at the elementary school level, and even at the secondary school, well, at this point, we don't have secondary schools yet, still elementary schools, primary school, basically. As more and more primary schools began to come about, there was a need for teachers, right? So they had this demand for teachers, and for whatever reason, again, it was just sort of it just sort of ended up that way, that women were taking more of these jobs as teachers. It was seen as a sort of woman's job, a female job, to be a teacher. So that forced them to open up the schools to women to become teachers. Okay, so it was like they needed schools to produce more teachers, in other words. So girls and girls began to enter schools at began to enter school in general at a much higher rate for that purpose. Okay, so he says, in the article, he says, however, teaching as a profession itself was rapidly emerging as an acceptable occupation for young women. Okay. So by the end of the 19th century, and then it says they outnumbered boys in secondary school. All right. Because secondary school in the early 1800s was not around yet. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but how they invented secondary school. But by the end of the 1800s, secondary schools existed, and then, of course, a lot of young women were in secondary school to become teachers. Okay, and in many ways, it's still true today, right? Teaching is still seen more as a female occupation than a male occupation, right? So that hasn't changed all that much. Okay, Hadi, is that okay?
All right, Prof.
Okay, next.
Okay. According to Gillis 1974, factory manufacturer by provision of an independent wage offers opportunity for young people to establish independent landless household and to enter into marriage of their own volition. And this is the ability for all the children to move out and establish independent household was limited only by earning. Hence, factory commissioners in England in 1982 reported that many 14 years old were independent this way. And this social and economic change were recognized in the law and abolished compulsory apprentice in England in 1814 and the demise of the dominant technique for the control of youth in the pre-industrial period. This is from Musgrove, 1964. And the early period of mechanization required the labor of children and young people in large number at that time. However, as technology changed, labor input decreased and higher skill labor was required and was monopolized by adult men. Unskilled labor and women and juvenile was still required and it's become more dispensable. This is based on Musgrove 1964. And youth unemployment and the attendant anxieties about social disorder become to loom larger in the public consciousness. Okay, next.
Okay, sorry, stop there. This is interesting. Does this sound familiar? Do you guys see any parallels here with what's going on now?
Yeah.
Where?
Technology change, labor input decreased, and higher skill labor was required.
I mean, that sounds like almost exactly what we're talking about today. IR 4.0, right? Higher technology, need for upskilling. It's the same thing. History is literally repeating itself. Okay, it's literally repeating itself. And in those days, as it says here, 14-year-olds were independent, working in factories. Now that's not necessarily a good thing. It's not. We're not making any value judgments here, but we're just stating a fact of history that in those days, 14-year-olds were working and as independent individuals and earning incomes as adults, right? Now you compare that to the way we treat 14-year-olds today. I mean, think about that. How do we treat 14-year-olds today?
Go play game.
I mean, seriously, think about it. It's like night and day. But it just shows you what young people are capable of. And this is what when he starts talking about youth work, you begin to see why youth work came about. Because in those days, if it was a norm for a 14-year-old to be working, starting a family, a career, all that, look at the way we treat 14-year-olds today, like they're 5-year-olds. And I'm not saying we're all guilty of it. It's the societal norm, and it's a global norm. Why is it a global norm? That's the thing that's really interesting. Nowadays, modern society, no matter where you go, it's the same thing. We all treat teenagers as if they're children, right? But this sort of shows us that it doesn't have to be that way. Young people are actually capable of really adult type of lives, of having adult kind of lives. So that to me is what's really interesting, really shocking actually when you read that and you think about the way we treat young people today. Okay, so I mean, look what goes on in secondary school. For example, the way we treat secondary school students, as if they can't even tie their own shoes, right? and look at the things. This is not even that long ago. I mean, the middle 1800s, late 1800s, that's only over 100 years ago. It's not that long ago that they were doing these things, okay? So it's just, I think it's quite interesting, and it's quite telling, because I've always believed that the way you treat people is the way that they be, you know, they react, or they act the way that they're treated, you know, they mirror that. So you treat people like kids, they act like kids, that kind of thing, right? You treat people like adults, they act like more like adults, right? Anyway, so let's move on. Anyone have any comments, questions? You want to add anything? Do you disagree with me? Feel free to disagree with me. That's what graduate school is all about. Discussing, debating.
Prof. Mahfuz
Yes.
here. I quite agree with you, because most of us tend to focus to the youth itself, but we don't focus to those who groom the youth. I mean, if you look at this one, okay, we say that we impressed that 40 years old can be independent, but then if we want to make our 14-year-old to become this independent, so we have to look at ourselves, how their parents treat them. Maybe the style of parenting is different from ours. Maybe from them, they need their sons, their daughters to work at early age to get their income. Whereas in our time, the parent itself is sufficient enough to gain income for survival.
That's a great comment, Mahfuz, because you're absolutely right. It has to do with the entire structure of society was different. Expectations were different. Culture was totally different, right? Even the psychology of having children as parents was different. I'm reading. There's another book I'm reading now about. It's called The Disappearance of Childhood, and in that book, he talks about how during this period, a lot of children didn't even survive in families, because in those days they didn't have the kind of healthcare we have today. So parents, when they had children, they didn't even know if their children were going to survive, you know, and so they didn't become that emotionally attached to their children the way we do today, because they honestly, only about 50% of children survived in those days. So even the way that they thought about children from the moment they're born is different than the way we do today. Every aspect of society was very different. So we can't just make the jump and say, well, if they treated 14-year-olds like that back then, why can't we do it today? Like, it's an entire societal kind of project. Like you said, starting from parenting, and then you have schools, you have the laws. I mean, there's so many different aspects of society that is designed to keep children young for a long time, you know, to maintain childhood for a long time. And so that's kind of the point of this article, is to sort of show how those societal structures changed over time to get to where we are today. Do you know what I mean? So it was a gradual process, you know, and it had to do with institutions like schooling. It had to do with the laws that he's going to talk about here. And so it's a lot of things that go into that. It's not just, you know, well, why don't we just start treating our 14-year-olds like adults? Get out of the house and go get a job. You know, it's not quite that easy, right? It's you know, but I mean, I think it's important, because even when you talk about, like, you know, there's a lot of criticism leveled against, like, for example, arguments against religion. People make arguments against religion, you know. Well, you know, during you know, like as Muslims, we say, oh, during Nabi's time, you know, they did things like this and like this. But, you know, being a social scientist is very interesting, because you're always thinking about, well, what were the societal factors at the time that came into play? And we have to understand that societies in past times, society itself was very different, right? So, like, we know now even just from this article that young people married at a much earlier age. You know, in those days, it was very common for people to get married at 11, 12 years old. Okay. Now, like I said, earlier, last class, I mentioned now it's pedophilia. It's illegal. It's something seen as disgusting and, you know, horrific. And so that was the norm back then. It was normal. 12, 13-year-olds, kids getting married. That was the norm. Okay. So it was a very different time, a different society. You know, you have to understand that. You have to appreciate that. Right. So, but that's why people they don't even think about history. They've completely cut themselves off from history. They don't realize that. They just say that, like, they assume that everything back then was done the way it is today. Like, no, no, no. It was a totally different society. Things were totally different back then. So we have to appreciate that. We have to have an appreciation for the way society was back in those days, right? Everything was very different. All right, so thank you. That's a very good comment, Mahfouz, and something we need to be mindful of, yeah. Okay. Okay.
Prof, can we stop for a moment because of the azan?
Oh, we're having azan already. Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
Maghrib
yeah.
is early. I don't hear my
Uh,
azan here. That's why.
because my surah is only bawah.
Ah, okay, okay. You're a stone's throw away. Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Take a
Just a
break.
moment.
Go ahead. Yeah, let's take a break.
Okay, let's continue.
Okay.
So next slide, Fatin. Okay. So hence, this is related to the previous slide. So government have intervened in the administrative and is applied to the children of workers. And the Factory Act of 1833 in England required no children under the age of 9 was to be employed in cotton mill or factories. And hours were to be limited to 8 hours a day for the working hours for those under 13 and 12 hours for those under 18. And okay, this is the important part. Factory owners should provide some elementary schooling for their juvenile employees. And as the 19th century progressed, the solution to the youth problem was increasing and cohesively applied to the working class. Compulsory and universal education to the age of 13 was instituted in the 1817 in Britain, and this practice is applied to the working class, only affected young children, and even them only erratically when school could provide and their labors. But over 13 years, many young people are workers, and notion of age were not focused, and school deal with students of all ages in one classroom, which mean from maybe 8, 7 mixed with the 11, 12, 13 in one classroom and individual tuition basis. But in America, based on CAT 1977, elementary school and secondary school population are not distinct. 7 to 17 years old were in the same class. Okay, it's same what I just mentioned just now, and guaranteed that the 17 years old would further their studies. Okay.
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff here. The first is the Factory Act of 1833 and the role that laws began to play. So once the Industrial Revolution started to kick in, a lot of the jobs started to move into factories. There were limited jobs, so they were, of course, the priority was to give the older adults the jobs. So then more of the younger workers became unemployed, right? And so that's the other thing was that there were reformers that were concerned about the well-being of young people, because in the factories in those days, the factories were very dangerous places. They were dealing with a lot of heavy equipment, and they didn't have the kind of safety, what do you call it? Precautions and so forth that they have today. So a lot of young people would get injured or even killed in the factories, and a lot of there were these social reformers that started to advocate for laws saying that okay, we need some kind of minimum age here for young people to work in factories because it's just too dangerous for them. And so that was also a factor as well. And then so these laws started to get passed. Now, when you have all these young people that were in factories or working, and now suddenly they can't work because of these new laws, what are they going to do? Right? Again, this idea of having all these idle youth, nothing to do. Well, we need to do something. And that's when schools started to kick in, okay? The idea of schooling, all right? What he says here about in the US, it's true. In those days, the schools that did exist, and they were often, like in the US, they have the famous one-room schoolhouse, it's called, where the schools were literally just one room, and all the kids, no matter what age, from 7 all the way to 17, in these kinds of schools, were all learning together, right? So you had intergenerationality, and that's why your slide, I like your slide, intergenerationality, where young people were used to socializing with older kids, older people, and then older kids were also used to socializing with younger kids, right? And so for those of you who come from big families, or if you have big families of your own, you know that younger and older siblings, they learn from each other. They learn to socialize with people of different ages, and like, for example, older kids learn to be sensitive to the needs of younger children, right? They learn to be compassionate and sympathetic for younger children. They learn to care for younger children. Younger children learn to be more mature by having to communicate with older children and so forth. So when you have this intergenerationality, there's a lot of social growth that goes on, okay? And with the advent of schooling, as we're going to see, once they started to put students in grades determined by age, they lost a lot of that ability to interact with young people of different ages, okay? Now, there are some scholars that say that was purposeful, and the reason is it was a way of controlling, because at this point, the purpose of schools was really to prepare young people for the factories, all right? Prepare them, give them the basic education they need to become factory workers later on, right? And then the elites, the top students, would then go on and become the managers, right? And so that's really what how these schools were originally set up, okay? So the public schooling system that we have today is really a continuation of that compulsory education system that came about during the Industrial Revolution, and the goal of it was to learn to create good factory workers. And that's why we have the problems we have today with education. And it's a whole nother topic, okay? So let's continue, we'll learn more about this.
Okay, now we come to the real moment in the establishment of the division of adolescent. And for your information, the real moment in the establishment of the adolescent was the secondary school. Okay, just take note, the secondary school. School separated children and youth from adult life. Secondary separated youth from children. On the 20th century progress, the school living age was extended to 14. This is in 1918 in England, and to 15 in 1947, also in England. And the fees for secondary was abolished in Britain in 1944. This is according to Roberts in 1983, and the impact in growth number of young people staying at school for the working class and young women. And in the 20th century, the age of compulsory education has been raised, and first to 14, then to 15 in Britain, to 16 because the panic over the rate of juvenile crime, or as a way to mopping up excess youth labor. And this is based on the Lawson and Silver in 1973. And the establishment of secondary school and the institutionalization of working class young people is not penalized until the post-war period. And new discourse of the teenager become established based on Doherty 1988. Okay, this is the real moment of the establishment of the adolescent. Okay, and guess, Prof, you want to add on something?
Yeah, so here we have it, okay? Establishment of secondary schools, widespread, okay? The secondary school system, really, okay? You had isolated, boarding schools and so forth, but the compulsory education system, which came into play, is what really began to extend childhood. Like it says, started to 14 and 15, 16, slowly, all the way up until what we have today in the post-war period. And as you can see here, what's really critical is that we see that the secondary school was not established for youth development purposes. It was established as a means of control, essentially, right? To deal with excess youth labor, to address juvenile crime, okay? It was actually implemented as a mechanism of control. And if you look at the way schools function today, all right? And there's been other really great scholarly works on this that have really analyzed not just, in a lot of the debate around school is about curriculum and subjects, language and all that. But if you look at the way schools are structured, okay, we have the bell every 45 minutes to change class. You only get 4 minutes between classes, and you have to be in your seat within that period of time. And you must obey your teachers at all times. You cannot violate the rules, and there's a gazillion rules in school, and you must have dress code and all that. All of this is conditioning for what? For, who can tell me? Control. It's all conditioning. Discipline, exactly. What they call discipline, but it's actually not really discipline. It's discipline in a sense, a discipline to external authority, which is discipline to teachers, and then of course by extension government and so forth. But it's not necessarily the teaching of self-discipline so much. Okay, it's external discipline. So it's obedience to an external authority. And of course, in those days, the authority was the factory worker, the head of the factory. Okay, and the society, the social order, because again, the issue of youth crime and all these things. So they were really set up as mechanisms or institutions of control. Okay, not youth development per se. And not to say that discipline is not part of youth development. It absolutely is. Self-discipline is critical, and we call it, in psychological terms, we call it self-regulation. The learning self-control and self-regulation and so forth. But again, this was not about teaching young people self-regulation. It's really more about creating an obedient class of young people that would eventually become good factory workers, right? And so it's very much tied to capitalism, very much tied to the Industrial Revolution, right? Where you had these captains of industry that were really dictating in many ways how these institutions were shaped and formed, because the Industrial Revolution was a big deal in the West. It was about power, it was about wealth and all those things. And so really today's schools that we have are not that much different than the schools that existed in those days. Again, they follow that very strict idea of regimented discipline, control, and so forth. And the whole system is designed for that. So now that when we say we want to create young people who are creative and who are innovative and entrepreneurial, and then you look at the school itself and how the school is designed and why it's designed that way, you can see the problem. Our schools today are not designed to create the kind of innovative, creative, entrepreneurial people that we need. There's this huge difference in terms of the goals and the design of schools and what is needed today in terms of the workforce. Okay, so it all goes back to this history, and that's why I say this history is so important to understand why we are in the situation, the predicament we are today. Okay, because schools really have not reformed a whole lot, in all honesty. All right, they're still very much industrial schools. Okay, and I just find that very, very interesting. We talk a lot about in youth development and in education reform. We talk a lot of it about, again, it always goes back to subjects. We're teaching the right subjects, and is the language the right language, but we don't even talk about the way school is designed, right? The whole structure of school, it's just very interesting. Okay, so should we take our break now, or do you guys want to continue a little bit more, or should we take our Margaret break? Good time to break?
Prof, how about I just finish my presentation and then we take a break? Is it okay?
Okay, sure. No problem.
Just one more slide.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next. Next, Fatin. Okay, this is the school living age. Late 80s, Western jurisdiction, the school living age increased to 18 years old by law, similar in Asian countries and in Malaysia, and by the combination of inducement like payment allowance and penalty, increasing credentialism making employment difficult for young people without upper high school education. And this policy to increase the effective school living age, the length of time spent in the adolescent is increased from 14 to 18, and the collateral damage arising from the ever increasing delay and ambiguity in adult status. And the last one, the construction of youth in the modern sense and the effect of the secondary school, the secondary divide young people from adults and from children, and weakening relationship across generation and strengthening age peer relationship, and isolated young people from economic and political processes and creating dependency. Okay, that's all from me, and we will continue after this.
Great. Okay,
Okay, Prof?
Roshakina, thank you so much. Yeah, so
You're
basically he concludes that first section of the article with this this sort of wrap up, you know, and he says very bluntly that, you know, the construction of youth in the modern sense is an effect of the secondary school. All right. Secondary school divided young people from adults, whereas previously they were working hand in hand with adults, right? They were working with adults as young adults, but still working as apprentices, you know, as side by side with them, and even in factories and so forth. So I'm sure they didn't see themselves as children, right, in those kind of roles. But then when they stuck them away from adults in schools and treated them in these very highly regimented institutions, where they're only able to interact with young people their own age. Okay, that's another instrument of control, is to segment students by age. And basically what it is it keeps them, socially, it keeps them in a very, you know, like I said, they lose those interrelational abilities to relate to other age groups, okay, and it keeps them sort of childish in a sense, right? And other scholars have sort of hypothesized that this is one of the reasons why there are so many behavioral issues among young people in secondary school, because they are kept and they're sort of treated like children, even though they have this yearning to be more like, you know, take on more adult roles, you know, developmentally they're perfectly capable of it, and we know that from history, and that's the kind of point here. All right, so it also weakens relationships across generations, like he said, all right, and it strengthens that age peer relationship. And what it is, you create this subculture of the teenager, right? They sort of see themselves as their own group, separate from adults, separate from the children, you know, and it creates an identity, a group identity. And that's the whole idea of the earlier part, the idea of creating that group identity. All right. It also isolates young people from economic and political processes, right? So they're not really considered to be adult enough to have their own economic activities and responsibilities. They can't really be involved in the political process, which essentially means you're dependent on adults, right? So they create dependency, right? And so this is often the argument against our current school system, right? Our students graduate and they're so dependent on the government. They're so dependent on adults, so dependent on corporations. They can't do anything for themselves, right? Don't we hear that all the time?
Yeah.
Yeah, we hear that all the time, right?
Yes.
And of course, the universities, we often get blamed for it as well, that we're not producing entrepreneurs, you know, every day and by the thousands and all that. Well, if you look at the way the schools were designed and are set up, and really what they're set up to do, you can kind of see why that is, right? It's very clear from the way it's presented in this article, that schools are not meant to do that. They're not meant to do those things. They're meant to actually keep young people dependent, right? They're not meant to produce independent young adults, which is what they used to be, all right? So I think it's a very powerful first part of the article, and I think it explains so many things. There could be, of course, we could debate so many of these things as well. There's other sides to this issue that we could look at, but we'll take our break now. Are there any comments or questions before we take our break? No? Okay. So let's go and take about 20 minutes. We'll try and come back here by around 7:40. That's okay with everyone? All right. Okay.
Yes, Prof.
Okay.
Okay.
Prof.
See you guys in a bit.
Right.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome back. Is everyone there?
Yes, Prof.
Hi,
Prof.
Doctor.
Hi. Okay. All right, so I think we will ask our presenters to try to finish up by 8:30, okay? And I will also try to help them to finish up by 8:30 by not interrupting so much. And then at 8:30, I will just briefly go over the assignment 2 in more detail, okay, as I mentioned, and then we'll call it a night, okay? So let's have our presenters continue with their presentation, please.
Okay, shall I continue, Prof?
Yeah, and actually in this section on youth work, I'm not going to stop you too much here because even though he talks about youth work here, we're gonna deal with youth work in another class more carefully. So I'll let you, of course, present. Go ahead and present. I won't say a whole lot about this particular section of the curriculum. Okay.
Okay, no problem. So I continue. Shall I continue?
Sure.
So the next topic is the creation of the youth works practices. Just now at the earlier presentation, Hadi was respond about the adolescent event problem society. So here, youth works emerge in within this process a response to a social problem created by it. So what youth society in this article precursor to the modern work practice emerged precisely during the period of the Glasgow Young Men Society in 1821, the YMCE Young Men Christian Association in 1844, and the Boys Brigade in 1883. So the purpose of this society tied to the process of the Industrial Revolution. The first is the growth of cities and the independent movement of young people to the cities to work, the disconnection from traditional kin and clan relationship and rural tradition, age streaming and strengthening of peer relation, the displacement of younger teenagers from the workforce, and the last one because of the problem of young people who were neither in school or at work.
Okay, so a lot of similarities to Malaysia, right? The growth of cities,
Yeah.
movement of young people to the cities. Okay, we've seen that in the past 30, 40 years, right, in Malaysia. And then disconnection from the rural areas, from the kampong, from traditional family arrangements and so forth. So a lot of similarities. Yeah.
Yeah. So next. Okay, what this organization provide? They provide a recreational space, resources such as libraries or reading rooms for informal education, opportunities for adventures, and the possibility of looking beyond the limited horizon of inner city industrial slum, the opportunities to organize and generate the resources, and the absorption of excess time and energy on the part of young people now underemployed and economically displaced. So here maybe the place for the young people to have their own space for them to meet a friend, and then maybe they can change uh, their their social problem. So
Okay.
anything want to add?
Right. So this is sort of how youth organizations and youth associations, this is really where they started and how they started, is to sort of fill that gap, fill that void between the previous, their previous role as adults and now sort of being that separate, unique kind of category or identity group, and having this need for other types of activities. And so this is really where it grew out of. Okay. So, and also it was just a concern that young people weren't doing enough and they were idle and they're going to get into trouble and all that stuff. So, so yeah, this is really where the youth organization movement came out of.
So just to add, in this article, said that Youth Works is characterized by its attempts to restore a sense of agency for young people and to work with them within their social context to negotiate their ambiguous and often prejudiced economic and political status.
Right. So youth workers act as social educators, basically, to empower young people to be able to take on more adult roles, even though, of course, they're limited by the structures of society. Okay.
So next. Okay, here is a youth grouping. Between 1960 and 1970s, the idea that youth or adolescent is constructed by the process of exclusion becomes common use question. Einstein 1965, which is the most functionalist analysis, he concerned with the social condition for the emergence of youth grouping rather than youth category. So according to him, the role of age grouping is universalistic in societies, is to integrate familiar structure with broader political and economic structure. Since he said that kin-based and family now have become private, divorced from economic and political function, therefore a risk of social disintegration happen. So, but however, it has several numbers of preconditions to ensure efficacy of the age grouping, which is the extent of harmony between the value orientation of age groups, institutional norms, and value of the social structure. To the second is the extent to which the identified evolved through participation in age group is adequate for attaining for full social status, and the last one, the extent to which fully institutionalized roles are allocated to age groups.
So this whole idea of age grouping is a very unnatural thing, actually, is what they're arguing. And of course, they had to make it work because of other, to ensure the functional, to ensure that society functioned, right? So, they're talking. This is a very sociological kind of thing, understanding, but they're trying to understand how these different age groupings of youth, how they can be integrated back into society in functional ways, so that there's not less disruption and so forth. Okay, so this is a lot of this has to do with youth and the implications of youth on economics, politics, and all the different ways that they engage with society. Okay, so there are the preconditions to ensure efficacy of age groups. So the harmony, like you mentioned, the harmony between values, orientations of age groups, institutional norms, and values of the social structure. Identity evolved through participation in age groups is adequate for attaining full social status. Institutionalized roles are allocated to age groups. So this is a really restructuring of society, actually, because none of this was prior to the Industrial Revolution. None of this existed. There was no need for this, right? So this is a really new way of organizing society. Okay, so these are really big changes that society went through during the Industrial Revolution, and the changes. They were major changes.
Okay, next. Okay, but sometimes it has an issue of deviant youth grouping, which is used as a social structure is functional if the age grouping has clear economic, political, and ceremonial rules. Failure in any of these areas will result in deviant youth grouping, including unorganized or organized group of delinquent youth, youth organization of revolutionary movement, and parties and rebellious movement. Rebellious youth movement.
So again, it created these subcultures, right? These age groupings create subcultures of youth, and if they're not well integrated into society, they can become deviant, right? So you have gangs, for example, right? A perfect example is gangs. young people that are considered to be marginalized, or they come from very troubled family backgrounds and poverty and a lot of reasons, they end up joining gangs. So you have these like very age-specific groups of youth that are doing very antisocial things, okay? If they're integrated into society in healthy ways, like through youth organizations, youth associations, school, and all these things, it's functional. In other words, society can function that way. But if they don't have those clear roles, then it becomes often problematic. And this is where we get deviant youth and all these things, okay? So he's trying to give a sociological explanation for how putting youth in a particular age grouping creates a social structure that has both, it can have both positive or negative impacts on society, and it often does, right?
Okay. In modern society, youth do not guarantee adult accreditation. Youth group have no clear social role and excluded from the economic and social participation. So this is another part when deviant youth grouping can be one of can happen.
Yeah.
But according to Einstein's stats, he said that the good side when this deviant happen, is it can make youth group one of the most important channel through which the various change of modern societies take place.
Yeah.
So it's that it can be deviant is not a bad thing, but it can be a good one for the youth group.
So can you think of a current Malaysian example of this taking place?
Example?
Like right now, like taking place right now, especially during COVID-19, this idea of youth groups, youth social groups, sort of having an effect on, at least maybe not changing the structure of society right now yet, but might, it could possibly happen in the near future. Think about, this idea of the gig economy, right? And all the young people that are in those type of gig economy jobs, all the food delivery guys and all these sort of gig economy jobs, it's creating sort of a certain type of subculture among youth in Malaysia now. And of course, policymakers now are even talking about it, what to do with these young people that are sort of stuck in these gig economy jobs, how to deal with them, how to upskill them so that they can go on to careers in different areas, right? So there's this negative perception of young people that are in this gig economy. Remember, there was that controversial comment by he was a UPM lecturer, actually. He went on TV and he was putting down the young people that are doing these types of jobs, and he got a lot of criticism for that, because there's nothing wrong. Of course, there's nothing wrong with doing that kind of work. It's legal. There's nothing wrong with it, but it does create a sort of subculture, a sort of an entire social group of young people that are doing these kind of jobs, right? And of course, they don't pay all that well, right? So it's hard for these young people to really provide a foundation for themselves, for their economic well-being in the future and so forth, right? So this definitely could become that kind of an issue moving forward, especially if it continues, especially the pandemic continues and the economic problems continue, right? So this might lead eventually to changes in public policy, for example, changes in educational policy, maybe, and how these young people are educated and how they, what they do. Okay, so that's just one potential example. Okay.
Next. Okay. Okay, there are also a generational effect also in terms of the youth work, which is conceptually a generational structure is different from an age structure. We grow out of an age grouping while we are part of our generation for life. For example, given in this article, which is baby boomers and millennial generation, maybe we are born in the different year, but in a millennium generation, same goes to the baby boomers. And then generation are located in particular points of history under particular condition of social change, and this create particular dynamics in the relationship between adult and the young. The generation that hold the power exclude and repress the rising generation. The older generation, to secure their own interests, impose restrictions of various kinds, artificially holding young people in position of economic and political dependency. For example, they extending qualification to take up the position, extending qualifying periods, and also maybe creating different class of employment. So these members of rising generation are kept in insecure, mobile, poorly resources or temporary position.
So can you guys think about a Malaysian example of this currently happening? It's in the news quite often, especially those third and fourth bullets. Anyone? Can you relate it to a contemporary Malaysian example?
So, Prof, maybe in my opinion, I see in terms of political issue, which is the older generation did not trust the young to give the position for them to show their credibility to memimpin negara lah, macam tu.
Right, exactly. Politics is exactly what I was thinking as well. We're seeing this all the time now. Even the advent of this new political party, Muda, is definitely, I think, in response to that. A lot of young people are getting very frustrated with the older generation that continues to hold on to power, refuses to give young people a platform for being involved in decision making regarding policy and so forth. So I think we're seeing this definitely in Malaysia, especially in the political scene. And I'm sure it's playing out in other areas of society as well that we don't maybe hear about every day in the news. And this will, I think, continue to be an issue because of the fact that these types of situations that we're facing is usually where you get structural changes in society because of the immense, the magnitude of the problem, with the pandemic and so many problems. So I think this is where you're going to see this kind of an issue really. It's going to, I think, get worse actually before it gets better. So, okay.
While the establishment of youth work as a practice is universal across modern society, its resourcing and institutionalized location has been highly variable. Youth work has been operated predominantly and sometimes exclusively within voluntary sector. Youth work does have official recognition and professional training, variously located within social work, sport and recreation, education and health or justice system. And then we need to remember that level of official recognition and support are vary depending on the country. Youth work is variable seen as separate and distant entity within other professional in identities such as social work or education.
Okay, so that's the little overview of youth work. So youth work is something we will deal with specifically later in the semester in a separate class, but here he's relating these changes going on in society at the turn of the century to the establishment of youth work as a profession. Okay, so youth work is an actual profession like social work, okay, for example. And in Malaysia, we actually have an association of professional youth workers. And it is a growing profession in Malaysia, even though we don't have as an established youth service like they do in the UK. In the UK, they have an established youth service where they hire and they have an entire field really of youth workers that are hired by the government to work with young people. Okay, next slide.
So next slide. Okay, this is the next topic, which is used as a scientific object, the discourse of adolescence.
Okay.
So first, we go to the history of the youth and adolescent. The story began and brought by G. Stanley Hall in 1844. Several commentators such as Moose point at Hall as the first psychologist to advance a psychology of adolescence in its own right. Steinberg said that Hall, the father of the scientific study of the adolescent, and Atwater suggests that the modern scientific study of adolescent began with Hall. While discourse of use were by no means absent for the pre-industrial and pre-20th century scenes, the Hall bring the subject use under the control of scientific discourse, claiming the terms adolescent to represent its new scientific status. So the whole ideology or interest in terms of the psychology, since his first job was school teacher and his first lecturing session was in psychology and pedagogy.
Okay, so with the creation of secondary school, we had all these, now we have all these young people in these separate institutions, right? They're in secondary schools, they're in juvenile reformatory kind of institutions. They have these boys clubs or these youth clubs. So now we have them sort of isolated and separated. Now they can be studied. Now they can be looked at as a group that is unique within society, separate from society. And so now they can be actually studied scientifically. And that is where adolescence actually got its name and got its invention from. And G. Stanley Hall is the father, they say the father of adolescence. He's really the one that really put forward the idea and the notion of adolescence.
Okay, I just want to add, Prof. The key notion, the adolescent is constituted by the stung and drum, which is storm and stress, originate from the issue happened in Germany, which is there were a number of literary and folk tradition about young people current in Germany at that time, which is there has Vanderburger movement and number of unsweden teenage heroes in the literary work of authors like Goethe and Schiller. So Horse, because of this, they have the notion about the adolescent is by storm and stress.
So what does everybody know what storm and stress refers to in terms of adolescence, teenagers? Storm and stress.
Storm and
so other than Nabila, can anybody answer the question? What do you understand by storm and stress when it comes to teenagers, adolescents? Any of you parents out there who have teenagers, you may be able to relate to this question. Anyone? What is storm and stress?
Can I try?
Of course, yeah.
It is such a transition from the childhood to adult, and then it creating some conflicts during the transition, and any inevitable conflict that arise during that period.
Great. Yeah, I think you nailed it, Huda, with the word conflict. It is about conflict. Now you mentioned about the transition. What are some of the causes of that conflict, do you think?
Perhaps they want to change their comfort zone of being the childhood, and then they are trying hard to be the adult.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so there's that social role element to it, absolutely. The early theorists of storm and stress also pointed to other things like during the teenage years, adolescence, we know young people, yes, there's the social role change of moving from childhood to adulthood. So they seek more independence, right? And this is what psychologists call individuation, meaning they begin to become individual adults or individual people, where they develop this conscience of the self, and they become more self-conscious. Also, they undergo a lot of physical changes. They undergo hormonal changes, puberty. They have social relationships with peers, especially peers from the opposite sex, relationships like that. So there's biological changes, there's social changes, there's role changes, there's physiological changes. There's a lot of change going on in those years. And so these early psychologists, when they started to do observations and research on teenagers and adolescents, they labeled this as the storm and stress phenomenon. Okay, and they made these hypotheses or these sort of theories that, most young people go through this stage of conflict, and they called it storm and stress. Okay, so yeah, you're absolutely right. It is really about conflict for many different reasons. Yeah. But of course, later that it became sort of debunked, this idea that all these young people go through this conflict. It's not actually true. There's this myth out there, this idea that, they all go, and many do, of course, many young people do have a lot of difficulties in the teenage years, but it's definitely not the norm. In fact, it's not the norm. Okay, Nabila, please continue.
Actually, beside Hall's ideology, they also have sociology, which is other contexts such as in sociology and anthropologists, which is sociology emerging was as a discipline at the same time, and anthropologists, notably by Margaret Mead, interested in the teenage years, especially in the social context of growing into adulthood.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Okay, this is based my understanding about Hall theories in this article. Okay, the Hall theories was based on idea from embryology, from a single cell organism until the fetus become recognizable human. He extended this idea beyond birth, arguing that human behavior is different in every stage of age, such as apes-like in early childhood, hunter-gatherer-like in middle childhood, and barbarian in adolescence. But this theory not survive well. The biological assumptions were wrong, and the psychological element were quickly overtaken by the experimental psychology movement. But the Hall theory, the foundation left by Hall was a concept of adolescence as a universal stage of human development characterized by great struggle in which the child metamorphoses into the civilized adult.
Yeah. So this idea of the age of transition, and that's still true in many ways. We still think of young people as adolescents, teenagers as going through this age of transition. That still pretty much not holds true, but that's still pretty much accepted from Hall's original theory. But the idea of great struggle has been sort of debunked in a lot of ways through a lot of different studies and research. Okay, proceed.
Okay. Continue debate within psychology and sociology, which is the key constituent idea brought by Foucault, cause as founding axiom. Three axioms embodied in this foundation has been the subject of continued debate. It has three notions, which is the first notion, lifespan is a series of discrete stages, each qualitatively different. The second notion is this stage is characterized by turmoil, by struggle, by stamp and drum. And then the third notion is this stage is inherent within the human and is universal across human societies. These three axioms has constituted the core of the discourse of adolescence, which has come to dominate the constitution of youth as a subject in profession like teaching, law and jurisprudence, social works and psychology. So other than the whole ideology, this is three axioms. Next.
Okay.
Okay, the other argument in this article is, which is modernity has created a specific form in which young people are marginalized from economic production and compulsory contained in age-specific cohort within the secondary school. Secondly, is a scientific discourse of adolescence has created a conception of youth as a discrete, biologically determined stage of life characterized by turmoil and trouble. The third is this discourse testify the maintenance and extension of exclusionary structure, including differential pay rates and employment regulation, legalized age-based discrimination and against the young and the prejudicial policing. And the last one, use words in recognizing the personhood of young people beyond their objectification, work with young people to enable them to manage the condition of their de-enfranchisement, challenge those conditions, and to achieve agency even while they stand. So these are the others argument in this article.
Well, yeah, this is also basically what the author's concluding is that all these different things. You know, basically the advent of young people and adolescents is a product of modernity and the Industrial Revolution more specifically. All right, and then it created a unique identity group, which created scientific discourse around adolescents, allowed them to be studied, allowed them to be separated from society, and creating laws specifically for them, and a whole bunch of things. And then this gave rise to the field of youth work, which was really to help young people to manage these conditions that they're in. Right. So that's essentially what the argument is in the article.
Okay, that's all from me. I have passed to Fatin to continue the next topic.
Oh, back to Fatin. Okay. Fatin,
Back to Fatin.
Okay, you're right. Thank you, Nabila. All right, so it's me again, but this time around, I'll be focusing on the end part, the final part of the presentation, that is on the globalization. All right, as my other two friends had discussed just now, they have elaborated and discussed about the development of youth as a subject gradually over the 19th and 20th century, that is in the West. So now we shall look into the era of modernization that is called globalization. Okay, all right. So there is an important thing to recognize about youth development in the West. The main element is that youth continues to change over time. So basically, in other words to say it is that youth tends to evolve based on time. So among the continuous changes for young people in the West is that there are three listed in the article. The first one is that while the nominal youth population shrinks as the population ages, the shift to a knowledge economy extends adolescence because the period of compulsory education increases from 20s to 30s. The second change is that choice biographies obscure structure inequalities, which then lead to the youth being responsible for their own conditions of choices about self-advancement. And then the third change is that the impact of disproportionate global financial crises lead them to create new intergenerational tensions, especially in the country of Spain and Greece, where the educated youth population face unemployment roughly around 40% to 50%. So that's the continuous changes that the young people face during globalization.
So we have this in Malaysia as well because if you think about, again, going back to the discourse on young people, we often hear the elders in society sort of putting the blame on young people for not being able to, for example, find jobs and all that stuff. The shift, as like they say, number 2 here, that the youth are responsible for their own conditions of choices about self-advancement. In other words, it's not adult society's fault that we have 40% youth unemployment rates. It's the young people's fault because they're not prepared for the working world. They're not entrepreneurial enough, right? They're not assertive enough in going out and getting skills so that they can make it in the world and so forth. So they shift this idea of shifting the blame to young people is quite common, and this goes on in, as he mentions here. This also goes on in Western countries as well, and it's quite common. The idea that adolescence keeps getting extended now because for young people to have those higher level of skills that they need to compete in the knowledge economy, they need to be in school longer and longer and longer. So now adolescence is getting extended even more, right? So now even 20-year-olds are, being treated and assumed to be more like children than before. Okay, so adolescence keeps getting extended as part of that process as well. All right. And then intergenerational tension because of the rising rate of youth unemployment. Okay, and this may be much more prevalent in Europe, for example, where you have countries where there's like 50% youth unemployment. It's very serious. And so it creates tensions. Young people start to get angry. They start to get frustrated, right? We saw the Arab Spring several years back, where all the young people in the Arab countries started to revolt against their governments, right? So it creates this intergenerational tension, which is very serious. I mean, you're talking about, you know, you're talking about rebellion, really, on a large scale. Okay, so it's very serious. Okay, Fatin?
Right. Okay. All right. Right, from the changes noted, it can be seen that globalization can mean a lot of things, can mean a lot of different things. So in the modern concept of youth, created through the establishment and reach of secondary schooling and scientific discourse, hence in the process, a variety of social forms are established. However, the process of welcoming young people into the Commonwealth are destroyed and compromised. This is according to Durham. So the authors had briefly listed the weakness of the modern construction of youth. There are 10 of them. So the first weakness is the disconnection of youth from economic life and economic contribution. The second point is that the disconnection of youth from other workers of different ages. And then it follows by the infertilization of young people, the contraction of their deemed capacities and amplification of their pathologies and risks. Next, we have the lack of a meaningful social role and alienation from key social institutions. Basically, youth are being discriminated somehow, right? And then the fifth weakness is the general pathologizing of youth and the equation of youth to trouble. Youth are frequently associated to making troubles, either socially or, you know, like become rebellious and all sorts of negative things. And then the sixth weakness is that the legal limits on young people's rights and powers, also follows by prejudicial treatment in policing, justing, housing, employment, incomes, and social policy. Youth is also being scapegoating for problems that belong to the social order. Everything is being blamed to the youth. And then schooling is seen to be the only competent means of education, just like what Prof has mentioned just now. School becomes the, you know, one kind of tool or means to make the youth obey to the authorities. And last but not least, the indeterminate and ambiguous means of graduation out of the youth category.
So this is a really comprehensive list, I think, of all the problems of the modern understanding of youth and construction of youth. And these are all very, you know, these are very serious implications. Disconnection from economic life, which we saw earlier in the article, you know, how young people used to be very much part of economic life in society, and now they're completely disconnected from it almost. I mean, how many, for example, how many, I don't know this answer to this question, you guys would probably know this better than me, but in Malaysia, if we asked how many secondary school students have jobs and work, what would be the percentage, you think?
I think very low, Prof.
Yeah, very low, right?
Yeah, in Malaysia it's very low, unless they are from the family of having poverty, some sort of like that.
Yeah, they
If
have.
they are still like middle class family, I think all of them are in the schooling age.
Right, yeah. So they're just not part of economic life. And even, I think even in the rural areas where young people are, maybe they were taking on like they were learning to be farmers at young ages and stuff like that. That's not even as much as, not nearly as much as it used to be as well. So I think that's one thing. And this disconnection from other workers of different ages, everything is very age segregated, right? And this creates an infantilization of young people where they become very childish and they act very childishly because they're treated like children, right? They're deemed to have very low capacity and very low expectations, and they can't do this, they can't do that, they have to be monitored all the time, that kind of thing, all right? And they have they lack social roles, all right? Even 20 years ago, 30 years ago in Malaysia, I mean, you know, like my wife talks about when she was growing up, you know, she grew up in a very big family, and as an older sibling, she had to take care of her younger siblings as if, in a sort of motherly. So when she was 10, 11 years old, she was taking care of her baby sister, for example, cooking and doing everything. That's an adult role that I don't think you see as much nowadays, right? So they're those social roles are shifting even within the families themselves, right? And the idea that young people are just causing problems and that's all they do is cause problems. So all these things, these are all very much interrelated to how we construct and understand and define youth, right? Anyone want to comment or add anything? No? Okay. Fatin?
Okay, all right. But Prof, I just want to raise my concern here. It's
Yeah,
just
sure.
like when reading this article, it seems like the author is it's not like he's going against the globalization, because he seems to list a lot of weaknesses about globalization, but there is none on the benefits of globalization.
Okay.
I'm not sure whether maybe he has reasons for doing it. So what do you think, Prof?
It's a good observation. It's a good observation. He's definitely a critic of globalization. Of course, I think he's trying to situate globalization within the context of youth per se, and the effects of globalization on youth. But yeah, no, it's true. I mean, you could definitely identify positive aspects of globalization on youth as well, and he doesn't do that. And so that's a fair criticism. I think that's a fair criticism. And I'm glad you brought that up. Every writer has a perspective, has their own sort of biases. And I think that is sort of the bias, the perspective he's coming from.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's good.
All right. Okay. All right. Moving forward. Okay. Through globalization, the modernization of youth is actually happening unevenly. Okay, so some of the factors affecting the modernization of youth is such as, the first one is the enrollment and reach of secondary schooling. It differs based on geographical locations. As example, 5% girls and 11% boys in Somalia are enrolled in secondary schooling.
Yeah.
But in Mauritius, equivalent numbers of 89% and 90% are reported for both girls and boys. Then it could be seen that a trend of increasing enrollment to a secondary school become a key development everywhere until the World War II. But nevertheless, the widening reach of secondary schooling is undeniable. So it seems like schooling up to secondary schooling is nearly made a compulsory for the teens and adolescents.
Yeah.
Right. The second factor that affect the modernization is that the speed of change, which differ between now and then. A process that took centuries in Britain and North America last time is now happening just in decades nowadays. And then the third modernization changes is that the third factor is that the sheer size of population differ across the globe, whereby like 200 years ago, the European population was relatively small, but current global population is very huge. So the young people population ages like 10 to 24 years old comprise about 25% of the world's population. So the population of adolescents become bigger compared to last time. Okay, and then the fourth factor is the disenfranchisement of young people across a wide range of contexts. This is indicated by the measurement of youth with unemployment or working or schooling. Across the globe, the percentage or the numbers of the unemployment, working and schooling youth are rather different, which support the author's argument of the uneven modernization of the youth. So all in all, yeah. Okay, Rob.
Sorry, Fatin. So Fatin, do you disagree or agree with him on these issues?
I think for these factors, I agree with the authors.
Yeah, I mean,
I agree with the author. Yeah.
These are just observations, really. I mean, it's undeniable. Like secondary schooling, in some places, it's there's in many countries there's high rates of secondary schooling, but in many countries still there's very low rates, and this creates certain inequalities. But also, what he's saying there is that he's trying to show that this extension of childhood through secondary schooling is now a global phenomenon, pretty much. Okay, so it's
Mhm.
it's everywhere, because everybody is sort of has adopted the same educational type of system, right? That's why you get all these similarities, like in how schools are designed and so forth. And then just the youth population is huge. We have this thing called youth bulge now. In some countries, like 60% of the population is youth. I mean, there's huge populations of youth, and like it's a real crisis for a lot of these countries, especially in the Arab nations, because they don't have the resources to provide all those kind of educational opportunities that these young people need, right? So it creates a lot of problems. Very challenging situation there, right? And then you have speed of change. Of course, things are changing very fast. A lot of youth unemployment and disenfranchisement, right? So these are really challenging issues that are global. Okay.
All right. Okay. So for the conclusion, all in all, the author argued that the youth work is a socially necessary mechanism to address the problems created by the youth itself in the modern world of today's. So the youth work can be either done at national, subnational, or prerogatives level. If modernization of youth is to go rapid globally, then the youth work also should go globally, so that they can work hand in hand in order to sustain each other, youth and the youth work. So that's for the conclusion, Prof.
Thank you very much.
Okay, all right, thank you, Prof. That's
All
all
right.
from our group.
Yes, congratulations. Very nice job, group. Thank you for the presentation. I think you did a great job covering the main points, the important points. It's a pretty long article, so it's a bit challenging, I know, to sort of summarize it up in a short period of time. But I appreciate your slides are very nice too. Okay, so I think this is a really important article for us in this class, for a lot of reasons, as I mentioned, and as we discussed tonight. There's a lot of things that I could ask, about this topic in relation to modern society. There's a lot of potential really good exam questions from this article too, which later we can discuss when the time comes. But I hope everyone was able to at least grasp the main gist of the article, and I think it's quite eye-opening in a lot of ways. So, are there any final questions or comments? No. It'll be interesting to hear from our students who are in China. Maybe you have some reaction, because the conditions there, again, every society is different, right? And every society constructs their notions of youth differently. So it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more on the Chinese perspective on these kind of issues. So I would just like to I extend the welcome to all the Chinese students in the class. If you want to share anything, please feel free to share. Okay, if not, then we can proceed. Let me just share my screen here. As I promised, I would give you guys a bit more detail about the assignment 2. Okay, so and this has been posted on Puja Bless, so you can go ahead and download this and read it on your own. All right, so the youth program organization or association critique. Okay, so I don't limit it, it's not limited to a youth program per se. It can be a youth organization, a youth association, a youth serving organization like Scouts or something like that. That's a youth serving organization. Okay, so you can choose anyone. Now, given the situation we're in with COVID and the pandemic and the lockdown and whatever, of course, you have to be able to access these organizations or programs virtually. So please choose one that you can do so, that you can access virtually. Because you may have to contact them through Facebook or through the internet, through website, whatever. So definitely choose one that has an online presence. Okay. So each student, you can do it individually or a group of 2. You can do it with a partner. Okay, but you'll be required to identify a youth development program, organization, or association, and carry out a critique of the program according to the guidelines provided below. So you should produce a 15 to 20 page report. That's a ballpark figure, okay? So just somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 pages. Don't go too far beyond that, and try to at least get up to closer to 15 pages. So to conduct the critique, you'll be required to obtain information about the program from various sources, including perhaps you may want to do online interviews with program leaders, program participants, and or other stakeholders. Program observations of program activities, of course, will be difficult now, given that we cannot actually go and observe programs. But if there are online programs, maybe through YouTube or through maybe on the websites or whatever, if there's some way of observing what they do, that would be good as well. Any kind of program related documentation or reports that they have available. All right, and this can be information from websites and so forth. That's all considered documentation. Okay. So try to contact people within the organization to get more information from them. All right. Also, you'll be expected to incorporate the theories and the content of the course into the critiques as much as possible. All right. And then you'll submit the critique at the end of the semester. So here's the outline, the content and the outline of the report, okay, should include the following sections and content wherever possible, all right. Each section should include a brief introduction. Try to relate the findings of each section to the course content, all right. So a brief introduction to the critique. So an introduction about, an introduction on the role of youth programs and organizations in youth and society. Okay, so you can get this from our materials in class, definitely. And then your methodology for how you conducted your critique. What kind of data did you collect? You know, who did you include in the collection of the data, etc. All right. General background of the program that you're critiquing. So the name of the program, philosophy, program mission, etc., etc. Okay, so as much of the information about the program you can get is helpful here. Preparation. So in terms of their program activities, who does the planning for the program activities? What role do the youth play in planning the programs and activities? So how do young people participate in the decision-making of the program? Okay, what are their roles? All right. If possible, find out how they do their program planning. All right. Later in the semester, I think it's week 6 or week 7, we're going to have discussion, our course presentation and discussion on youth-centered program planning. So for that course, you can use a lot of that material in that lecture and the article that goes with it for a lot of the content here. Okay, you can get a lot of that content here in terms of planning programs, youth-centered programs. So just follow these questions. Now these questions you can use if you do interviews with program leaders, program participants, or whatever. You can use many of these questions to get the information from them, okay? And then the program activities, how they're implemented, what do they do, what kind of activities, do they evaluate their programs, how are they evaluated, okay? So these are just guiding questions for you to use, okay? Future program needs, all right? What's needed to improve their program, okay? Now, again, I'm using the word program here, but this can be the whole organization itself, right? So it doesn't have to be necessarily a specific program. It can also be the organization itself, right, that you're talking about. Okay, and then conclusions and recommendations. Okay, so you can download this and go through these questions more closely. If you have any questions, you need clarification, just let me know. I'll be happy to help. And then I've also, as I mentioned, I've also uploaded, let me see here. That's not it.
Prof,
Yeah.
sorry for asking, but for this assignment, right, you said a group of 2.
Yeah.
But can we go at least 3, because since we already have the presentation group, so we can just go on, you know, like just go with the current group, I guess. I don't know if everyone agrees. Then
Well, okay, it's like this. If you want to do a group of 3, my expectation of quality is higher. Okay, first of all, groups of 3 tend to be,
okay.
well, with assignments, group of 3 tends to be a bit tricky because in terms of the amount of work and the responsibilities of doing the work, it can be a little bit difficult to sort of dole out the work with 3 people. So this is not that, it's not really that long an assignment, to be honest. 15 to 20 pages is not very long.
Yeah, I understand.
So I'd prefer if you keep it to 2. If you want to do 3, again, you can do it, but I would expect, in terms of what you produce, I would expect it to be substantially of better quality and more, essentially. So if you want to do something that's more ambitious with a group of 3, that's no problem. You can do that. Okay. But in terms of the assignment as it's given, I would try to limit it to 2 if possible. Okay.
All right. It's okay. Thank you.
All right. No problem. Feel free to ask. I mean, I'm usually very open to negotiation. Okay. But in certain cases, it's for a reason, that I set it up that way. But anyway, this is an example of one of the examples that I have. I took the names out for anonymity, confidentiality. But this is one of the examples of the critiques, and this is one of the good ones. So I'm going to just post this up on Putra Blast for you. Okay, so you can see what kind of thing is expected. Some of these are very detailed. They have budgets and everything. I don't expect that much detail in terms of a budget and stuff. I'm not that concerned with it, but just to give you an idea. So this is from the class on youth-centered programming. So they have the planning phases and the planning approach in here. Okay, so this is from our class actually. So you can see it's quite detailed, this one, and they reference some of the class materials to explain the different sections of the program. All right. So you can download this on your own. You can use it as a reference, and I'll put up, as I said, I'll put up 3. So you have, and they're different. They're different, and it's good. I want them to be different. I want you to be creative in how you do it. Feel free to, to be very unique in how you do it. Just try to give us a really strong overview of the program or the organization. Try to incorporate the class material as sort of background, and explanation maybe of why they do certain things that they do, and that sort of thing. All right. So if you have any questions at any time, please just let me know, and I will be sure to upload the other 2 on Puja Blessed. Let me see here. I still can't understand why that didn't come up. Oh, I've been logged out. Yeah, it's still not there. Okay. Well, I will, right after the class, I will go ahead and upload those critiques. Okay, are there any questions at this point? So I would just go ahead and download all that stuff and then go through it when you're ready to start. And then as questions come up, feel free to ask me if it's not clear.
Hello, Prof.
Yeah.
Hi, it's me, Haizum. I just want to ask about the if we are going to interview the organization, how about the letter of consent from the faculty? Is there any soft copy that we're going to get somewhere?
No, if you'd like a letter from me, I can give you one. This is not, I don't consider this to be a formal research project. This is just a class sort of project. But if you feel better, if you'd like to have a letter, if you think that'll help you, I'm happy to do it. Just let me know.
Oh, all right. Okay. Thank
you. Yeah, and what I'll do is I'll do a general one, and then you can just fill in the specific information about the name of the program and so forth. But if you have, like some organizations, they may require specific information. So if you have that need, just let me know.
All right, sure. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for asking. That's a good suggestion. Because that could come up. That could come up. In fact, I think now that I think of it, I think I did do one last semester. I'll check. Anyway, what I'll do is I'll just post it on Putra Blast, and then you can just download it and then fill in the information. Like a form, they call it a form letter, like a general letter, and then the specific information about your organization, the organization you're collecting the data from, you can just plug it in.
Prof,
yeah,
I have one question.
Sure.
Can an impact study among youth as the respondent can be considered as a youth development program?
What's in it? What do you mean by an impact study?
Let's say there is a study being conducted among youth as the respondents. Can it be considered as a youth development program? so that we can do critique for this assignment. Let's say like in the Ministry of Youth and Sports Ministry, there is a impact study being conducted among youth as the respondents. So can that kind of study be considered as a program, a youth development program?
I don't think so, only because I don't see how you would answer all those questions about the program, about the planning and all that. This assignment is really about some sort of youth organization or youth program, youth initiative per se. You'd have a very hard time answering those questions if it was just on an impact study. Although you may want to find out more about the program that study is based on. Maybe the program that study is based on, you could do. Do you know what I mean? You could use that as the program that you want to critique. But yeah, I don't know, an impact study, I don't see how you would do it. If you think you can, maybe just share it with me. Let me look at it. And I can give you.
Okay. All right, Prof. Sure. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. If there are no more questions, then we can wrap up for the night. Okay. Okay. Anything else? You guys look pretty awake for 9 o'clock. That's pretty impressive. For those of you who have your screens on. The rest, I don't know, maybe they're sleeping, so who knows. Okay. Well, have a good week, everyone. Anything, just let me know. You can WhatsApp me. You can get in touch with me. Okay?
All right. Thank you, Prof.
All right.
Okay. Thank you, Prof.
Okay. Thank you, Prof.
Have a good night.
Thank you, Prof. Assalamualaikum. Thank you.
Salam.
Bye.
Bye.